Hi, everyone. This is Tori Vandelin with Prevent Connect. This podcast is part one of a three-part series where Susan Gomberport interviews Amy Thompson to discuss close to home as a community-driven approach to violence prevention.
Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Gomberport, an independent researcher and evaluator. I do a lot of my work in partnership with communities of color and other marginalized communities. So I'm thrilled to present this series of interviews for Prevent Connect that focus on community-driven approaches to violence prevention. And today it is my absolute pleasure to speak with Amy Thompson, who is currently on the leadership team of the Resonance Network. Prior to Resonance, she was the founder and executive director of Close to Home, where she developed mobilization strategies to foster community-wide responsibility to prevent domestic and sexual violence. Amy's going to tell us all about Close to Home during our chat together. So welcome, Amy. Yay.
Thank you, Susan.
Yes. So why don't we start with you telling us, just kind of in your own words, just a quick overview of what Close to Home is about, just like maybe a couple sentences. And then maybe you could share with us a little bit about your story and what drew you to doing this work.
Sure. So Close to Home is a community organizing or community mobilization approach to both respond to and prevent domestic and sexual violence. And the approach engages community members, so that includes young people and adults and the civic life of communities to really develop and implement solutions to prevent violence and change social norms.
Okay, great. I know it's a very rich program, so I'm really looking forward to digging in.
Back in the 90s, many years ago, I was living in Boston and living in a neighborhood of Boston that's called Dorchester, and engaged there in some really exciting youth organizing work. So it was youth organizing related to youth violence prevention. And I was working with a lot of amazing organizations and community leaders that had a really strong racial justice lens and focus to the work. Many of the people that I was working with had been involved in work in Mississippi in the 60s with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so there was this really rich organizing history that was being brought to this youth violence prevention work that I was doing, and really learning a lot from. And the focus of that work was really about what was happening with violence in the public life of the neighborhood, what was happening on the streets and in public spaces. And as we were doing that work, there were a number of things that happened, some very difficult things with the young people that we were working with, where their own experiences of domestic and sexual violence were really entering into their lives in ways that was, disrupting their role as leaders in the community and as activists, and engaging them in ways with systems that ended up being very harmful to them. And so it really led us to start to ask some questions about how could we engage the energy that was mobilizing in Dorchester related to the public violence that was happening. Why wasn't that energy being engaged to address domestic and sexual violence? And how could that happen? How could we help frame domestic and sexual violence as public community issues that the community could come together and take action to do something about? So that was many years ago, and so that was one aspect of the question. And the other aspect of the question was, how do we think more proactively about prevention? And so, and so with some of my neighbors, we got together to think about that and to start to try and experiment with different strategies. And then over a couple of years, realized that based on what we knew about organizing, there were some lessons that we could apply to the issues of domestic and sexual violence from community organizing. And then there were things that we still needed to learn. So that's just a little bit about how it got started.
Yeah. So I'm really curious. You said that you got together with some of your neighbors. So tell me more about. So you were engaged in like some work around, the sort of violence that was cropping up, and specifically with youth.
Mm-hmm.
Who were these other folks that you were bringing in? Like, who were these neighbors?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, so I lived in the community where I was doing the organizing. I lived there for over 20 years, and so it was really, it started with the other folks I was doing organizing with that also lived in the community. It led to conversations with other community partners that we were doing our organizing with. That included other nonprofits, folks in the faith community. I was working at a local health center. So there were, just looking at we really mapped who were the key stakeholders in the community, what were the strengths in the community, the physical, like in the physical space, what were the civic entities in the space that were actually really contributing a lot of engagement towards these other issues, and how could we harness those same community strengths or community assets towards these issues of domestic or sexual violence. And then that became a core aspect of what became Close to Home's assess phase, right? Like, so it was really through this experimentation and applying what we knew worked on one set of issues to this other issue, through the process of trial and error. So.
Okay, that's really interesting. And was this piece, when you first started it, before you started thinking of it as like, there's kind of a way in which we do it, but when you were still in the sort of let's just try a thing and see what makes sense to us, and in conversation with each other, was that work, like, I'm trying to think, like, was that part of your original project? Is this outside that? Like, was it volunteer time? Was it, what did all that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for a long time, it was just volunteer time. It was just a lot of piloting in the evenings, going to community meetings, talking about it. I had a day job that was very supportive of me going out and doing that. I actually got a very small fellowship at a local university that provided me with access to the university library. And so I was able to go in and look up books and sort of get a sense of what else was happening both in the US and abroad on this, which was super helpful. And through that small fellowship, I also was paired with a sociologist at the university who helped me do some thinking, right? And helped me kind of do some sense making of what I was learning and what I was trying. And then I had to write stuff up, which helped me it forced me to synthesize my thoughts.
So it sounded like you were pulling together a lot of different resources in kind of a creative way, right? Like drawing on your own organizing background, with neighbors and other people interested who have a stake in this community. And also, I was really curious to hear about these university resources, and that it sounded like there was a moment when you started synthesizing and thinking about this as maybe more of like an approach. Tell me more about that. How did that?
Well, I think that the vision for there was a really clear vision of how do we think about engaging family, friends, and neighbors, and all of us to see this work as part of what we do in our everyday lives. Like, that was a really clear vision. How do we make this part of the civic conversation of our communities? That was really clear too, of like, that's where we need to go. I think that the process of figuring out what could that look like took a lot longer. I piloted this for, I would say, almost 4 years, very, very part-time on the side in the evening. I was doing different things. And then we were able to get some startup funding as part of a larger grant that came into the neighborhood as part of a coordinated community response grant. And then we had the resources to actually go a little bit deeper, right? To spend more time. And so that certainly helped, right? To have the resources to deepen the effort. But I feel like it was probably 3 or 4 years even after that, until we started to actually be able to draw a picture of what we were doing. And so this incubation phase, it lasted a while, and it wasn't resourced for much of it, but it was exciting, right? To be in a place where we were just driven by a real belief in the possibility of the power of community and neighbors, and a real hunger to see what was possible. And then again, as we already said, I use the example of the community mapping and assess, and also knowing from other organizing the real power of popular education style dialogue together. How do we just keep let's not do training, let's engage in real inquiry with each other about why this is happening and what we could do about it. And that became the talk phase of the close to home approach, but it took time for us to kind of look over our shoulder and say, okay, that's what we did. That these are the things that actually worked. Because there were many that we tried that didn't, right? And that's part of the process of experimentation and figuring something out.
Right. Wow. So I love this idea. It makes me really think about when people talk about other kinds of startups, right? Profit, where it's sort of like, I had this day job, but I also had this passion. And it took me a while to figure out how to resource that, but I was building in the background. And I would love to hear a little bit more about the folks that you were working with, and just a little bit about, it's hard sometimes to maintain that kind of effort over time. So who were they? Who were the other sort of stakeholders and collaborators and allies? And what were they bringing to it? And what was the stability of their kind of investment in it? Like, do people come in and out, or how did that kind of shake out?
Sure. Well, in the beginning, as I said, that there were some key community leaders and both formal and informal leaders that were invested. So leaders of local institutions in the neighborhood that just really believed also that that wanted to sort of crack this puzzle of how can we get family, friends, and neighbors involved in this and really create community-driven solutions. And then there were also neighbors on, around the corner, right? The one person in particular I'm thinking of who was very committed to partnering and had been very involved in the community in other ways already. And so was really excited to put her energy into this. And she brought her neighbors and friends into it. So I think finding those key people, formal and informal leaders, allies, that really have a shared motivation to engage. And I think that there was a core group of us, a small core group of us. I don't know how many, maybe 5 to 10, the first few years that were, really excited. And some of us met on a weekly basis. Some of us met less frequently, to try to figure out what does it look like on a particular street to do this. And which was really powerful. But then one of the things we learned over time from that is that if you have too small of a core, that and then things come up in people's lives, right? Then it isn't as stable. And so a huge learning that we had from some challenges with having a really small core team of volunteers was realizing that actually we needed a more flexible structure to think about how we organized our work. And so it was around that time when that core group of volunteers said, we actually need a break from this. We said, oh, we need a more nimble structure. And so I started to do a lot of learning and having a lot of conversation with folks about a network and how can we actually grow a network, a more flexible structure where people can engage in different levels of involvement and participate in different ways and actually self-organize based on their capacity and interest. And so that was a big turning point for us several years into the project. So it's just another example of you start with one thing and then find actually that there are both opportunities and weaknesses in it. And then how do you adapt in that moment? and use it as a learning opportunity rather than I mean, it was stressful, but rather than a moment to say, oh, this is a failure, right? It's like, oh no, we need to adjust.
Need to adjust. And how did the other folks feel about that kind of moving more from a core group to more of a network approach? Because I know that sometimes it can feel like a loss of control in a way, or like you get worried, right? Like, well, but if we open it up to other people, is it still going to like remain focused on the things we really care about?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it going to shift to things that it doesn't seem quite like where we were really envisioning it to go?
Yeah, I think we definitely had moments like that where there were those questions. I think we had those moments when there were staff transitions, and because the work is so relational, I think that I think that is just something that comes up right in the life cycle of work. Because we want things to grow. There were conversations. We want more people involved. We want this to grow. And then when it happens, you're right. There is a sense of, oh, but things are going to change. And so, but then it's like, how do you then strengthen that community? Like, how do you build community with people that are new and still create intimacy, And so I feel like a network offered us a great way to do that because people could still gather in small clusters around specific work they wanted to do, but then be part of a bigger we that was advancing a bigger vision. They could just play the role they wanted, in the way that they had the time, right? Or interest at the different seasons of their years or lives. Because, we all have different capacity at different points in the school year or summer or our just life cycle.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And sometimes we need that fallow time, right, to be able to come back and grow later. So it's interesting. As you've been talking, I really am noticing the role that relationships and relationship building played. So I'm curious, like, what did that look like? Like, was that an intentional thing? Did you already know each other, and then you're bringing in new people, right? So then, how did you bake that in to rather than just like, okay, here's what we're going to do to get together? How did you create that bond?
Well, I would say that it was like foundational, the relationship piece. One of our biggest expenditures was food.
Yeah,
Really believing that if we can sit together and eat together, like that's the way this is going to happen, that we're going to change these norms of isolation and shame in everything we're doing, in how we're creating the work. We're actually going to sit and do that together. And there was a lot of storytelling, there is a lot of storytelling about how these violences have affected our own lives, how domestic and sexual violence are connected to other violences that people are experiencing, whether it's racism or homophobia or the anti-immigration climate that we're in. All of these, we have to be engaged in thinking about all of these things as interconnected. And then the storytelling becomes really personal and really profound. And so I feel like that was part of it. And then I think that another part of it is, how do we also bring joy and laughter to this work? And so I think that many people came into the network because they cared about their community, they cared about the issues, but I think people stayed because of the relationships. So,
right. No, I think that is so powerful because, sometimes we get caught up in the kind of like, there's a way in which like professionalization can kind of interfere with our like heart connection in a way. Right? And the thing that really drives us and the passion behind it to work. And I'm curious, like I know that it seems like these relationships were really meaningful to you, right? Like that was part of what was propelling you forward and gave you the energy to in the times when it was not so much paid work, but really volunteer work. How did that feel to you?
Oh, it was so powerful. And I think that it was, I mean, I really think that it's in the crucible of our relationships that transformation can happen, right? I mean, it can happen in many ways, but this is such an important way, right? And in the crucible of community, and in where it gets hard, right? Where there's hard stuff happening, and there's people are using violence, and we're having to have conversations about that. And that we're really living into this idea of what it is to live in beloved community, not in the utopic sense, but in the sense of how do we all show up as our full selves, the messiness of that. And I think that it was a lot. There was a lot of learning. I had come from more of an advocacy environment, and even a more clinical environment in which I was doing my work in a healthcare setting, and where there are like very clear parameters and boundaries.
Right.
And so it's a shift to move from that kind of engagement to engaging kind of in where we're like locked arms. Where we believe that we're all peers, and we're engaging as peers, and we're sharing our full selves with each other. It's a different, I'm not saying like a better or worse, but it's a different, it has a different texture of interaction, and it's powerful, and it's probably my preferred. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I understand there's like a time and place for those more boundary kind of settings, and other places where part of the work is actually trying to pull down some of those boundaries.
Exactly.
So it sounds like, so I'm just curious, and you don't have to answer this if you want, but inevitably in this kind of work relationship building, there can be ruptures or things that you need to tend to. And I'm curious if there's either an example that springs to mind that you could share, like how that was tended to by the group, or even just like an approach that in general you all ended up using when that sort of thing happened.
That's a good question. I wouldn't say that there was a singular approach that we used. I think that there were examples of ruptures, or I don't know if rupture would be the word, but where there were I feel like we were creating community that had a shared set of values related to how we want to be together, like what we thought it meant to live in a way that was not causing harm. And I think that when harm did happen in the context of the network, in the context of the community that we were building in Dorchester, I feel like some of the key aspects of it were being able to have direct conversations with each other, being able to tell the truth about what happened, still being able to hold each other in love. And then I think sometimes like figuring out what is the accountability when those things happened. And sometimes it did mean that there had to be clear boundaries around certain things, especially when there were safety issues involved.
Right.
So I know I'm speaking very abstractly, but
no, that's fine. It's really whatever you feel comfortable sharing around that, because of course you're holding the confidence of a group of folks. So I understand there's a responsibility inherent in that. Yeah.
I guess what I will say is that I was deeply moved by the people in the network's capacity to hold accountability and love at the same time, like deeply moved by that. And it was a huge learning, I think, for me and for many of us, just I think there's more for me to think about and like reflect on related to learnings there. But it was one of the most powerful things that has stayed with me. Yeah.
I can imagine. Thank you for sharing just a little about that.
Thanks for listening. Tune in to part 2 to hear more about Close to Home's community engagement and evaluation with Susan and Amy. Want to engage deeper with this podcast? Check out the Prevent Connect e-learning course based on this interview. A link is provided on this podcast's page on our website.